Part 2. The darkness beyond the door felt almost suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the air itself had thickened, creating a barrier between them and whatever lay ahead. The small beams of light from their flashlights trembled slightly, as though the darkness was somehow alive and pushing against them. Dmitri stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. The others hesitated but followed, aware of the weight of the moment, making their steps slow and deliberate. As they ventured further into the room, they saw that it wasn't a typical warehouse space. The floor was made of polished metal, and strange glowing lines ran across it, etched into the surface like veins of some alien material. There were no shelves or crates here, just walls lined with large, complex machinery. It was clear this place had been the heart of whatever experiments had been taking place in the abandoned radio station. What is all this? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dmitri paused, standing next to an array of monitors that flickered dimly, displaying strange, indecipherable symbols. This, he said, was the control center. The machines you see here are not just transmitting signals, they're creating them. These frequencies are the key to the rift, and the people who worked here, they believed they could manipulate time, space, and even consciousness itself. Mark took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the room. Are you saying this place was trying to open a portal? A rift between dimensions? Dmitri nodded grimly. Yes, and the experiments were conducted with little understanding of what they were truly dealing with. The rift, as they called it, didn't just open one way. It pulled things from all over, from different times, different realities. It didn't matter what came through. It only mattered that it did. The eerie silence of the room seemed to press in on them. The buzzing of the machinery, though faint, felt ominous. It wasn't just the past that seemed to be contained in this space. It was as if something from the future, or perhaps from another world, had bled through. Olivia moved closer to one of the monitors, squinting at the screen. Look at this, she said, her voice trembling. The monitor displayed a shifting image of a dark sky with strange, swirling clouds that didn't look like anything from Earth. It was a storm, but unlike anything they had ever seen. In the center of the storm was a shape, distorted, flickering in and out of existence. This doesn't look like any kind of storm I know. It's not from our world, Dmitri said quietly. It's the result of the rift. That storm, it's something that slipped through. And that's just one of the things that has made its way here. But the worst part is, they couldn't control it. Mark turned to Dmitri. So what now? You brought us here. What are we supposed to do with this thing? Dmitri didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward a large circular device in the center of the room. Its surface was covered with what looked like symbols etched into the metal, glowing faintly, glowing through. There were cables running from it to various parts of the room, connecting it to the other machines. This, Dmitri said, looking at it with a mix of fear and fascination, is the heart of it all. It's the last of the technology they used to stabilize the rift. It's been dormant for years, but it's still active. Olivia, her eyes wide, stepped closer to the device. And if we destroy it, can we close the rift? Can we stop whatever is still coming through? Dmitri's gaze shifted to the device, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might tell them the truth, the whole truth. But he hesitated. I don't know. All I know is that if we tamper with it, we risk making things much worse. It's like a dam holding back an ocean of chaos. If we try to stop it, we might unleash everything that's been kept back. The group fell silent, contemplating the gravity of the situation. They had already seen glimpses of the strange forces at play, and now they were standing at the threshold of something far more powerful than they could have imagined. We can't leave it like this, Daniel said, his voice steady but full of determination. If this rift is still open, it's only a matter of time before things get worse. People will keep disappearing, and whatever's coming through will only grow stronger. Dmitri looked at him, his expression a mixture of fear and agreement. But how do we stop it? I don't think anyone knows how to close this rift for good. The engineers didn't even understand what they were doing when they opened it. And now, we're the ones who have to deal with it, Olivia finished, a steely resolve settling over her. Whatever it takes, we have to figure this out. We have to stop it before it spreads beyond our control. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of the room's history was pressing down on them all. The path ahead was uncertain, and the risks were enormous. But in the face of the unknown, there was no other choice but to move forward. "All right," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "We'll find a way to shut this down. Together." Dmitri nodded, stepping aside to let them examine the central device more closely. "If you're sure about this, then we need to be careful. We don't know what consequences our actions might have. But there's one thing we do know. If we do nothing, this will never end." The air seemed to hum with tension as they prepared for what would come next. Would they be able to close the rift, or had they walked into a trap they couldn't escape from? The answers were hidden in the machine before them. And now, with no turning back, they had to make a decision that could shape the fate of their world, or destroy it. The group stood in tense silence, their flashlights casting shifting shadows over the strange device. The air in the room felt charged, as though the unseen energy from the rift was pressing down on them. Mark crouched beside the machine, running his fingers over the glowing symbols etched into its surface. "This thing still has power," he muttered. "It's been sitting here for decades, but it's not dead." Dmitri exhaled sharply. Because the rift is still active. Whatever they did here, it wasn't just a one-time experiment. It's been running all this time, sustaining itself. Olivia turned to him, frowning. "Then why hasn't anyone shut it down? If it's still active, someone must have known." Dmitri hesitated, his face darkening. Maybe they did know. Maybe they tried. A heavy silence fell over them as the implications sank in. If the people who had built this technology couldn't stop it, what hope did they have? Daniel crossed his arms. "We need to figure out how this thing works before we start messing with it. If we just start cutting wires, we might." A deep hum filled the room, sending a shiver down their spines. The machine was responding to their presence. One of the screens flickered to life, displaying a distorted image, grainy, shifting between static and brief glimpses of something moving. Mark took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat. "What the hell is that?" The image sharpened for a split second, just long enough to reveal a figure standing in a dark corridor. The thing was humanoid, but its proportions were slightly off. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The worst part was its eyes, two pinpricks of white light staring directly at them through the screen. Then the image was gone, replaced by static. Olivia recoiled. Was that here? Dmitri grabbed her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move. Now." The hum of the machine grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat. Something was happening, and it wasn't waiting for them to decide their next move. "Shut it down!" Mark barked, turning to the controls. He reached for what looked like a power switch, but the moment his fingers touched it, the entire room flickered. Not the lights, the room itself. For a fraction of a second, they weren't in the radio station anymore. The walls, the floor, the machines, they all vanished, replaced by something vast and incomprehensible. A dark expanse, stretching infinitely in all directions. Shapes moved within it, distant, shifting forms that seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly rhythm. And then, just as suddenly, they were back. The walls were solid again, the floor beneath their feet real. But the machine's hum had changed. It was no longer a steady pulse. It was erratic, almost panicked. Daniel grabbed Mark's arm. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Mark breathed, "but I think we just saw where the rift leads." Dimitri's face was pale. "We have to leave, right now." "But we can't just..." Olivia started, but then she heard it. A sound. Not from the machine. Not from the monitors. From the hallway they had come through. A slow, deliberate footstep, and then another. Something was coming. And it wasn't human. The group froze, every breath held as the footsteps echoed through the hallway. Slow. Measured. The sound of something moving with purpose. Mark's hand hovered over the machine's controls, but he didn't dare touch anything else. His mind was racing. Had their interaction with the device brought something through? Or had it simply woken up whatever was already here? Dmitri was the first to react. He gestured sharply toward the far side of the room, where a rusted metal door stood slightly ajar. "Move," he whispered, barely audible over the humming machine. "Now." No one argued. Olivia was the first to slip through the door, followed closely by Daniel. Mark hesitated just long enough to see the flickering screen one last time, still showing nothing but static, before he and Dimitri ducked inside. They found themselves in another corridor, narrower and even darker than the last. The air was thick with dust, and the damp scent of decay clung to the walls. The only illumination came from their flashlights, casting jittery beams ahead as they moved. Behind them, the footsteps continued. No longer distant, no longer slow. They were getting closer. Daniel swore under his breath. "We need to lose it. Fast." "Where does this lead?" Olivia asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Dimitri scanned the walls, searching for some sign of an exit. "Not sure, but I know one thing. We can't go back." A loud clank rang out from the previous room, the sound of metal being disturbed, something heavy shifting, and then silence. The footsteps had stopped. Mark tightened his grip on his flashlight, feeling his pulse hammering in his skull. "I don't like this." Neither did anyone else. They pressed on, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The corridor twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the complex. Finally, they reached another door, this one much older, its wooden panels swollen from moisture. Dimitri tried the handle. Stuck. "Help me," he hissed. Mark and Daniel moved to his side, pressing their shoulders against the door. On the count of 3, they shoved. The wood groaned in protest before finally giving way, the door bursting open with a sharp crack. They stumbled inside, finding themselves in a large chamber filled with rusted equipment. Old desks, broken radios, and stacks of abandoned files littered the space. A single cracked window let in the faintest sliver of moonlight. But none of that mattered, because Olivia was staring at something on the far side of the room. "Guys," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Look." They turned, and there, in the dim glow of their flashlights, stood a figure. Not quite human. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked slightly to the side in an unnatural pose. The same glowing pinpricks of white light where its eyes should have been. But the worst part? It wasn't standing in front of them. It was reflected in a dusty, broken mirror. But there was nothing in the room, no one, only them, and the thing watching them from the other side. For a moment, no one breathed. The figure in the mirror remained still, its glowing eyes locked onto them, unblinking. The jagged cracks in the glass fractured its image, distorting its long, gaunt limbs and stretching its face into something even more inhuman. Olivia took an involuntary step back. "Tell me someone else sees this." "I see it," Mark whispered. His throat was dry. "But it's not here. It's only in the mirror." Dimitri slowly waved a hand in front of the glass. The figure didn't move. It remained frozen, as if it were merely a reflection of something standing just beyond their reality. Daniel swallowed hard. "We should go, now." No one argued, but as they turned toward the door, the old radio equipment in the room crackled to life. A burst of static, a fragmented voice. "See you." The lights on the ancient control panels flickered. The dials twitched, as if unseen hands were adjusting them. Another burst of static. Then the voice returned. "Behind you." A deep, guttural click. Everyone spun around at once. The mirror was empty. The figure was gone. But the room felt different now. Colder, heavier, like something unseen had just taken a step closer. Dimitri swore under his breath. "We're leaving. Right now." They didn't need to be told twice. Moving quickly, they exited the chamber, retracing their steps through the dark corridor. The air had changed. It felt thicker, pressing against their skin like a damp veil. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of machinery droned on. The complex was still alive, still breathing. But so was something else. The group reached a branching hallway. Dimitri hesitated. Left or right? "Whichever gets us out faster," Olivia said, glancing over her shoulder. Mark turned his flashlight down both corridors. The left sloped downward into more darkness. The right led to what looked like an old access tunnel, lined with rusted pipes. He pointed right. "That way." They hurried forward, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The sound bounced unnaturally, as if something unseen were running alongside them. Then, another noise, not their footsteps, a scraping sound, slow, deliberate, coming from behind. Mark dared to glance back. His flashlight beam barely reached the far end of the corridor. But for a split second, he thought he saw movement, a shifting of shadows. He didn't wait to see more. "Faster," he urged. The group broke into a run. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing damper. The scent of earth and rust filled their lungs. Then, finally, a metal ladder, leading up. Dimitri was the first to climb, pushing against the rusted rungs with everything he had. Olivia followed, then Mark, then Daniel. As Mark reached the top, Dimitri shoved against the heavy hatch. It groaned in protest, stuck from years of neglect. Below them, the scraping sound grew louder, closer. Something was coming. "Push!" Olivia shouted. Mark and Dimitri pressed their shoulders against the hatch. It resisted for a moment, then suddenly gave way, swinging open with a burst of freezing night air. They scrambled out onto damp ground, stumbling into the open. The wind hit their faces. They were outside. Dimitri slammed the hatch shut, twisting the rusted lock into place. Silence. Only the howling wind remained. No one spoke. No one moved. They were out. But whatever was in that place, it had seen them. And somehow, deep down, they knew. This wasn't over. Back in Kyiv, the group tried to return to normal life, but the memories of the underground facility lingered. Mark, in particular, seemed affected. He was quieter, more withdrawn. Though he didn't mention it to the others, he had started avoiding mirrors. Every time he caught his own reflection, there was an unsettling feeling, as if something in the glass wasn't quite right. Olivia, unable to shake the need for answers, spent hours researching old Soviet documents, digging through declassified archives and obscure forums where urban explorers shared their findings. One evening, she found something. An old, barely legible Soviet report from the late 1980s mentioned a classified experiment in an underground research facility near Pripyat. The project's purpose was vague, but one detail stood out, a reference to an entity that existed only in reflections. Subjects exposed to the anomaly reported disturbances in mirrored surfaces. Over time, symptoms worsened, culminating in complete dissociation. Several subjects experienced the phenomenon of reflection misalignment before their disappearance. Further experimentation was deemed unsafe, and the project was abandoned. Olivia's stomach turned as she read the last note in the report. Under no circumstances should an affected individual be allowed prolonged exposure to reflective surfaces. The entity attaches itself through observation. She immediately thought of Mark, his strange behavior, his unease around mirrors. Had he brought something back with him? A sinking feeling settled in her chest. She had to tell the others. Olivia didn't waste time. She called Eric and Daniel, her voice urgent as she explained what she had found. They agreed to meet at Mark's apartment immediately. When they arrived, Mark hesitated before letting them in. His apartment was dimly lit, with all the mirrors either turned to the wall or covered with sheets. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. I didn't want to say anything, he admitted, his voice unsteady. I thought it was just my imagination, but something's wrong. He gestured toward the bathroom. Look for yourselves. Olivia and Eric exchanged glances before stepping inside. The bathroom mirror was the only one he hadn't covered. Olivia swallowed hard and flicked on the light. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then Mark stepped into view behind them, and Olivia gasped. His reflection was delayed, just a fraction of a second, but noticeable. When he lifted his arm, the reflection lagged before copying the movement. Jesus, Daniel muttered, stepping back. Mark's breathing grew unsteady. It's getting worse. Last night, I swear I saw it blink when I didn't. Olivia's mind raced, remembering the report's warning. Prolonged exposure is dangerous. We need to do something, she said. Now. Eric looked pale. Like what? What if it's already too late? A deep silence filled the room. Then Mark whispered, I don't think I'm alone anymore. The air in the apartment grew thick with unease. Mark's words hung in the air, heavy, heavy and unsettling. Olivia could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She glanced at Eric and Daniel, who were both visibly shaken, but there was a shared determination in their eyes. We can't just sit here and wait for something worse to happen, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. We need to figure out what's causing this. Mark nodded, his face pale. I've tried looking online, but nothing seems to make sense. I thought maybe it was just sleep deprivation. But now, I'm not so sure. Daniel's voice broke through the silence. What if it's not just the mirror? What if there's something more to this place? Something we missed before? Olivia's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Daniel looked around, his gaze lingering on the covered mirrors. Maybe it's not just about the mirror. What if there's something tied to the apartment itself? Something from before we got here. Mark shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the sink. I thought about that. I checked the history of the place. It was a regular building. No unusual activity, at least not on paper. But what? Eric asked, his voice low. Mark hesitated. There's a story. Something I didn't want to believe, but after everything that's happened, I'm not so sure anymore. He paused, looking at each of them. There was a woman, a tenant before me. She disappeared. No one ever found her. Olivia's stomach tightened. How long ago? A few years ago? A few years ago, Mark replied. The police thought she'd left on her own, but I don't know. I found an old newspaper clipping about it, tucked in the back of a drawer. It just seemed too strange to ignore. We need to know more, Daniel said, his voice firm. If this is connected to her, we can't risk it. Olivia nodded. We'll start digging, but we need to move quickly. The group stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, before Mark finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I think it's already too late. The room fell into an uneasy silence after Mark's chilling words. Olivia, Eric, and Daniel stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Mark. There was a growing sense of dread in the air. Olivia broke the silence, her voice low and cautious. I keep thinking about Dimitri. There's something off about him. How did he know about our first trip? About everything we went through? Eric frowned, his brow furrowing as he recalled the strange interactions. He always seemed too interested in our story, like he knew more than he should have. But how could he possibly know everything? Mark's expression darkened as the unsettling truth began to settle in. He was the one who found me this apartment. I didn't ask him for help, but he insisted. Said it would be perfect for someone like me, someone who needed peace and isolation to recover. He knew exactly what I needed, but now I'm wondering if that's the whole point. What if he's been guiding us all along? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. But how could he know? What's his connection to all of this? How did he find us in the first place? We didn't tell anyone about our plans. Mark shook his head, his thoughts spinning in circles. That's just it. He didn't need us to tell him. He was already in the loop somehow. He found us, arranged everything, even that damn apartment. Olivia's heart began to race as a horrible realization dawned on her. Do you think he's been watching us this whole time? What if he's not just some random guy who helped us out? What if he's been part of something bigger, something dangerous? The thought hung heavily in the air, and they all exchanged uneasy glances. Eric crossed his arms, his jaw tight. We've been so focused on everything that happened after we went to Chernobyl, but what if this started before that? What if Dimitri knew what was going to happen to us before we even stepped foot in that place? Mark's face tightened. What if he's been orchestrating all of this? What if he's the reason we're being followed, why we're seeing things in the mirrors, why we're trapped in this nightmare? Daniel's voice was a whisper, barely audible, but the weight of his words hit like a ton of bricks. We need to find him. We need to figure out what he's been doing and why he's been involved. The room was suffocating with the realization that their involvement with Dimitri might have been no coincidence. There was a deeper connection they hadn't seen before, and it was terrifying to think how far Dimitri might be involved in what was happening to them now. Olivia swallowed hard. We need answers, and the only way we're going to get them is by confronting him. He knows something. I can feel it. Mark nodded, his gaze distant but resolute. We're going to find him, and we're going to figure out what the hell he's been hiding from us. The tension in the room was palpable. Mark, Olivia, Eric, and Daniel exchanged determined glances. The thought of confronting Dimitri filled them with unease, but there was no turning back now. We need to meet him, Mark said, his voice low but firm. We can't let him control this anymore. We have to hear him out, get answers. I don't care what his plan is. We need to understand what he's been doing to us. Olivia nodded, though she could see the fear behind Mark's eyes. I don't trust him. He's been too involved in all of this from the start, but we need to get him to tell us everything, whether he wants to or not. Eric paced back and forth, frustration clearly mounting. This isn't just about him anymore. It's about what's been happening to us. The mirrors, the dreams, the feeling that something's watching us. Dimitri knows more than he's letting on. We can't just keep running from whatever he's pulling us into. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. I still don't get it. Why does he want us to come back? What's so important about that place? We barely made it out of there alive. Mark's jaw tightened. That's the thing. He keeps leading us back to the same spot. He's drawing us in. He wants us to go back to the place we barely escaped from. Maybe he's waiting for something. Or maybe he's trying to finish what he started. Or maybe he's just toying with us, Olivia said, her voice a mix of anger and fear. But no matter what, we need to go to him. We need to confront him, figure out what the hell he's up to. And we have to be ready. We don't know what we're walking into. The decision was made. They couldn't keep running or hiding. They had to meet Dimitri face to face and find out how deep his involvement really went. As they left Mark's apartment, the unease in their hearts grew. The city outside was quiet, the streets empty and cold. But their destination was clear. Dimitri had arranged a meeting place. And though they didn't know exactly what awaited them, they knew it would lead them back to the place they had escaped from, the place that had changed everything. They arrived at the location Dimitri had specified, a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city. It felt eerily familiar. The same sense of dread crept over them as they stepped inside. It was as if they were being pulled back into the same web they had barely escaped. Dimitri was already there, sitting in the far corner, a dark figure in the shadows. He smiled when they entered, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I was wondering when you'd come, Dimitri said softly, his voice smooth, almost soothing. I hope you're ready for the truth. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the table. We're not here for your games, Dimitri. We want answers. We want to know what you've been doing, why you've been leading us back into all of this. Dimitri's smile didn't fade. You think you have a choice in this. You've always been a part of this, whether you like it or not. Olivia felt a chill creep up her spine. What the hell are you talking about? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. You think I've been leading you back to that place because I want to trap you? No. I'm just giving you what you wanted all along. You never truly escaped, did you? That place? It's calling you back, and you'll come, just like you always do. Eric's fists clenched. No, we barely survived. We're not going back. Dimitri's expression hardened. You think you're free? You think you're safe? Everything you've seen, everything that's happened, this was just the beginning. That place was never meant to let you go. It's always been watching, waiting, and now it's your turn to finish what was started. Olivia's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. What are you talking about? What do you want from us? Dimitri's smile returned, but it was colder this time, filled with something darker. I want you to understand. You can't escape it. Not now. Not ever. It's all connected. You're here because it wants you to be, and now you'll go back, whether you want to or not. The weight of his words settled heavily on them, and the realization hit hard. Dimitri had always been part of this twisted game. He wasn't just some guide. He was orchestrating it all, leading them back to the place they had barely survived. Mark's voice was quiet but filled with resolve. We'll stop you. We won't be a part of your plan anymore. Dimitri's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but his smile never wavered. We'll see about that. The tension in the cafe was palpable as Dimitri's unsettling words echoed in their minds. For a few moments, no one spoke. They were all trying to process what had just happened, but the weight of his final statement hung over them like a shadow. Dimitri stood up slowly, his smile never leaving his face. I need to take care of something, he said, his voice casual. I'll be back in a moment. Without another word, he walked toward the restroom at the back of the cafe, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. Mark watched him go, a growing unease stirring within him. Something didn't feel right. Dimitri had been too calm, too confident. The things he said, it didn't add up. After a few minutes, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The longer Dimitri stayed in the bathroom, the more suspicious he became. It wasn't like Dimitri to just vanish. And besides, the restroom was close enough that they should have heard him if he was still inside. I'm going to check on him, Mark said, his voice low but firm. Olivia looked at him, concern in her eyes. Mark, are you sure? What if he's just... I need to know, he cut her off, his jaw set. He couldn't explain it, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. Mark made his way toward the restroom, his footsteps quick but careful. The cafe was eerily quiet, with only the sound of faint chatter from the few customers seated in the back. As he reached the restroom door, he hesitated for just a moment, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. The bathroom was empty. He blinked, surprised. The small room, dimly lit by a single flickering light, seemed unchanged. There was no sign of Dmitri. The sink, the stalls, all appeared as they should. But there was no sign of him. Not even a sound. Mark stepped further inside, his eyes scanning the room carefully. The door had been shut when Dmitri entered, and there was no other way out of the bathroom. No windows, no ventilation shafts, nothing that could explain how Dmitri had disappeared. He checked each stall, the small space growing colder with each passing second. But there was nothing, no trace of Dmitri. As Mark turned back toward the door, his heart started to race. His thoughts were swirling. How could Dmitri have disappeared so quickly, especially in such a confined space? If he had left through the back or side exit, they would have seen him. The street outside the cafe was visible through the windows, and they would have noticed any movement. But Dmitri wasn't there. He was gone. "Mark, what's going on?" Olivia's voice called from the doorway, cutting through the silence. Mark turned to face her, his face pale. "He's not here. He's gone." "What do you mean he's gone?" Daniel asked, joining Olivia in the doorway. "There's no way out of here. The place is tiny." "I don't know," Mark said, his voice strained. "There's no way out. I've checked. There's nothing. He just disappeared." A cold, uneasy silence fell over them. Olivia's gaze flicked around the bathroom, as if expecting Dmitri to jump out from behind a stall, but there was nothing. The air seemed to thicken, and the room felt darker than before. "Did he ever mention anything about the bathroom before?" Eric asked, his tone cautious. Mark shook his head. "No, but he's been acting so strange, like he already knew what was going to happen, like he's part of this, whatever this is. And now he vanishes in a place where there's no way out? I don't trust it." Olivia crossed her arms, her brow furrowing. "It's like he was never here in the first place. We need to go. Whatever game he's playing, I don't want to stick around to find out." Mark hesitated. There was something unsettling about the whole situation. Dmitri had known too much, and now he was gone without a trace, as if he had never existed in the first place. But Mark also knew one thing. This wasn't over. Dmitri had been leading them into something, and he had been watching them closely. There was a reason he had lured them back here, to this small cafe. It wasn't just a random place. They left the bathroom together, each of them casting wary glances around, unsure of what to expect next. The sense of being trapped, of being watched, only grew stronger. Whatever had happened to Dmitri, whatever game he was playing, it wasn't over. And they couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. End of part 2.